not talk in the middle. Great.
Yeah, please, everybody please, huh?
Yeah, cool. Also, if at any point I'm not audible, you can let me know. Alright, starting in 3, 2, and 1. I think some important framing of what Mexico looks like right now, right? One, I think it's extremely important to know the Mexican government is extremely corrupt, meaning one, cartels have gone ahead and essentially lobbied one, political officials, but second also the police, and lastly the militaries as well. They go ahead and do this through one, things like criminal intimidation, etc., but more importantly, through things like feeding them money, etc., to go ahead and incentivize them to support the government. But second, I think there are a large number of cartels in Mexico at all points in time. One, they're extremely decentralized. Understand that these cartels have gone ahead and there are multiple number of cartels, meaning there's not a singular leader or a singular head at all points in time. Notice that a lot of cartels have gone ahead and gotten the government on their side. Notice that it's hard to track things like revenue or the leaders in these cartels, insofar as there's so many and you can't inherently go ahead and get to know anything about them, and insofar as they're extremely decentralized and you have no particular mechanism to go ahead and have a central messaging at all points of time. But second, there's a lot of conflict in Mexico. What's that probably look like? One, understand that cartels go ahead and fight for things like roots, power, money, etc. But more importantly, insofar as there's so much conflict, people become collateral damage. When collateral damage happens, people go ahead and lose faith in the government for not being able to go ahead and counteract this measure, or not being able to go ahead and put on sort of conflict at all points of time. But lastly, notice that there's a loss in government trust. Why? As I've already gone and showed you, government is extremely corrupt. But second, insofar as the government is extremely incapable of insofar as they are corrupt and are being run over by these cartels, people go ahead and have directly opted into the community services being given by these cartels at all points of time. I mean, these cartels go ahead and do basic services, like essentially give the community some sort of money by saying, oh, if you opt into our cartel, we'll go ahead and take care of you, right? I'll go ahead and show you why that's extremely problematic and why we're able to go ahead and fix this in our speech, right? Well, what are the burdens on government side today? I have to go and show you, one, how to reduce conflict and illegal activity, but second, how government is able to go ahead and gain some sort of trust and increase its sovereignty in its country at all points of time. One, notice how this policy probably goes ahead and works, right? I think one, government has the autonomy to go ahead and choose a cartel that's one, extremely cooperative to them, but then second is easy to work alongside at all points of time. Understand why this is good. One, you're able to go ahead and incentivize them to get things like important information on things like roots, leaders, etc., where they're saying how they operate the cartels, etc. Insofar as you're able to go ahead and do this, you're able to use government resources to go ahead and strategically remove these cartels, or at least at the very least go ahead and destabilize them. How is this essentially good? This brings me to my first and most important argument. You have reduced conflict. Notice, what government can now go ahead and track these leaders and go ahead and essentially take down these trade routes and all points of time. Insofar as this is true, you're able to one, go ahead and destabilize these cartels to an extent where you're able to go ahead and cut out important supplies of things like them moving drugs, them getting money, etc. But second, insofar as this is true, you're able to go ahead and reduce the number of capacity of them producing this or going ahead and making money or essentially putting out conflict into the country at all points of time. You're able to go ahead and systematically take down a lot more cartels that exist insofar as you're able to go ahead and join in one cartel. Insofar as this cartel gives you important pieces of information, you're able to go ahead and wipe out a lot more of the other cartels that exist in the country at all points of time. This is systemically good because one, in status quo, there are so many other countries that go ahead and inflict this upon the people. They fight against each other and people become collateral damage. On our side of the paradigm, you're able to one, go ahead and essentially be with one cartel, but as a side benefit, you're able to go ahead and remove many other cartels that inflict this sort of pain and suffering onto other people at all points of time. But more importantly, you're able to go ahead and systematically destabilize a lot more of these cartels, meaning you're able to, on comparative, bring down the number of the conflict or the amount of money that they're getting or the amount of illegal activities they go ahead and do, etc., right? But now the most important impact, before I go here.
You're claiming that there are multiple cartels. If so, how do you choose the one you want to get?
I just said this, right? You go ahead and choose this. If so far as you see which one's one most cooperative with you, but second who's willing to give you the most information. Notice now the important impact on government side, right? Insofar as you're able to go ahead and systematically destabilize these cartels, you're able to one, reduce the number of conflicts that exist at all points of time. Insofar as these cartels don't have as many money or as much resources, they don't have the resources to go ahead and fight against each other, meaning people aren't collateral damage anymore, and essentially people are, insofar as there's not as much conflict happening, and you see that the government is taking active incentives to go ahead and push down this conflict. I think me as a citizen, I'm much more inclined to trust the government now, because the government is taking active steps to go ahead and reduce the number of conflict or reduce the number of illegal activities going on in Mexico at all points of time. This is especially good because one, it increases the number of the amount of trust that people have in government at all points of time. But second, as I've already gone and framed to you, these cartels go ahead and give some sort of community help at all points of time. They essentially go ahead and help the people. Insofar as I'm able to systematically break down these cartels, one, they don't have the resources to go ahead and help out the people. But second, insofar as it's true, these cartels do not exist, I'm able to go ahead as the government, essentially intervene and go ahead and become the savior for all my people at all points of time. People now depend on me for things like basic resources, and insofar as this is true, I'm able to get way more government trust on our side of the ballot. This is why this is especially important. One, insofar as you have government trust, you have better implementation of policies. Notice that insofar as the government is extremely destabilized and extremely run over by these cartels, you don't have the fiat to go ahead and run the policies you want to, because you're always going to be run over by these cartels with the idea of criminal intimidation, etc., etc. But more importantly, that you can't counteract these mechanisms at all points of time. Insofar as you're able to systematically destabilize them and also gain the trust of people in the process, they're able to one, have the implementation of policies insofar as people are cooperating with you at all points of time. But second, insofar as you have way more government trust, people don't revolt to things like law and order. Meaning, people don't want opt into a lot of these cartels insofar as they're not able to provide community, etc., etc. But more importantly, insofar as these cartels do not have resources that they're able to make, they're not essentially put out as much content. But insofar as people trust the government a whole lot more, they don't go ahead and revolt to things like the police or the military that goes ahead and tries to stop these illegal activities at all points of time. Insofar as this is true, law and order is much more strengthened because people essentially are able to cooperate with the police and the military in going ahead and stopping these drug cartels at all points of time. But lastly, understand, insofar as there's stronger trust, people opt into government policies more, meaning you have better ideas of education and formalization. Insofar as this is true, you're able to push ideologies of not opting into illegal ideologies or illegal activities at all points of time, meaning this becomes a core ideology of the mass population in your country. Insofar as this is true, one, opting to these cartels reduces on a large scale, because one, these cartels aren't able to help out your community and not give you these sort of services, but second, it's now against your ideology to go ahead and do illegal things, etc., etc. Insofar as this is true, we think we're able to one, go ahead and significantly reduce the amount of illegal activities that happen, because one, people just don't want to opt into this anymore. But more importantly, when the cartel can't give you any proximate benefits, you don't have the necessary incentive to go ahead and give your life for this cartel, insofar as this cartel isn't able to go ahead and give you any sort of benefits for your family at all points of time. I mean, people don't opt into these cartels anymore. We reduce conflict, we reduce illegal activities.
Very good. Explain is why cartels in the status quo have large incentives to make sure that they are mellowed out, that they do not cause the kinds of problems that the worst case of Gov is trying to work on. The first reason here is because they don't want a massive government mandate to stop these cartels. When you bring more guns into this area, when you spread more toxic, more harmful, more potent drugs that harm people, this is the point at which people have large reasons to make this the single reason on which they vote. This is when the government has massive reasons to make this pour all of the state resources into stopping these cartels. And escalation of this conflict often means that the cartels have to revert to spending less money on obviously the production of these drugs and rather on survival. But the second reason here is because this is a profit industry. This is not terrorism. These are drug cartels that want money. So obviously they benefit from stability in the region that the governments can provide. They want to make sure that they are not creating massive state distrust. They want to make sure that the government is able to provide some sort of baseline security for normal citizens, because this is the point at which they're able to make the most amount of money within this region. Sure.
Cartel violence was able to eliminate more than 20 plus political leaders before the
Okay, cool. On your side it gets worse. I'll explain why. But also just know that there's probably not as much corruption as Gov wants to explain, because the more and more corruption that you put into the government, the more visibly obvious it becomes. The more that the people distrust the state, the more that it becomes difficult for the states to protect these cartels in a way that makes it profitable for them. Okay, cool. The next thing I want to explain is why on their side the violence with these cartels becomes way, way worse. The first thing here is that obviously government's policy is operative on this because they want to explain that the government is able to essentially wipe out these smaller cartels, these alternative cartels. But in their best case, obviously, the demand for drugs is inelastic. These cartels are going to still try to survive and still have massive amounts of resources in the status quo because they have well-established sources of income, because they have large reserves and they probably export a lot of these drugs, which means that they're able to make lots of money regardless. What this means is that they will find a way to survive. They will make sure that they escalate the conflict because they have no alternative anymore. This means that they are likely to pour more guns into the area so that they're able to fight off law enforcement. This means that they're more likely to employ like the most desperate measures, the most depraved measures that Gov wants to talk about. What is like the end impact of this? The first is that you likely end up with civilian areas and like the vast majority of areas becoming a war zone. Why is this true? Because obviously now, all of these cartels, which now had an incentive to mediate between each other so that there was stability in the region, have a common enemy to work against. But the government and the cartel that is being protected now. Firstly, on the government, they will make sure that they are able to bribe as many more officers as they can, because this is like obviously their policy still is like faulty to the kinds of corruption that they are talking about. What this means is that they're likely to find some this is probably likely to breed a lot of distrust within the government and state institutions. But in terms of like attacking the cartel that is being protected, there are two problems here. The first is that obviously this new this protected cartel is eating up as much of the profit as these alternatives could have made. So you have massive incentives to deploy the worst kind of measures and escalate escalate conflict against this cartel, so that you are able to minimize the amount of market share that they are eating up. But the second thing here is that obviously you want to make sure that you still maintain some portion of the market. So even if in the best case of Gov, you're able to protect some sort of cartel that is providing decent drug, like the most viable drugs to normal people. The problem is that you then try to find alternative revenue sources, which means that you probably revert to way worse drugs. You probably revert to more convincing methods of getting people to get drugs, even if it's at their own personal detriment, because now these people have an alternative that you are trying to make less persuasive. What does this mean? It means that you just have way more conflict in the region. It just means that you have to revert to the worst instance, the worst problem statements that Gov wants to talk about in order to survive. You probably go out and you try to kill people in the streets, because this is how you make the government seem less effective. Why is state distrust probably the most likely method through which these other cartels are going to operate? Firstly, because when these cartels are able to make the state seem less less reliable, it means that people are less likely to opt into giving the state information. It means that these people are less likely to go to them for any type of protection, because now they will revert to cartels that are with. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Do people like the cartels they live under right now?
See, the problem is, unless you explain why these cartels are creating some sort of war zone in the status quo, you are not able to explain why there's such a mandate for this motion in the first place. But the next thing I want to explain is okay, why are people's lives ruined by this? And this is just the most simple impact here. Firstly, because obviously instability in the region is incredibly detrimental to people's lives, and they escalate that problem because now these cartels have reasons to make themselves more depraved. But additionally, when you revert to the worst kinds of mechanisms on their side, people are less likely to opt into state institutions for protection, less likely to opt into information sharing, and you don't even get their benefits because their model is dependent on trying to find more information in order to protect themselves. Thank you.
Here, I thank the other for what was an excellent speech, inviting DPM to continue the case inside opening government. DPM will
I'll be going as DPM. I should be starting in 30 seconds. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition's case is cartels are good because you necessarily don't have that much violence, because this is the system that exists in status quo and this is running, so let's just run with it, right? Understand two fundamental flaws in their case. Number one, they go ahead and tell you that having these individuals who are in these cartels is good, because they say that dependency towards these cartels go ahead and exist, right? We're going to prove to you structurally why being dependent on these cartels in the first place is bad. Understand the most fundamental impact that we push in this debate, right? We tell you that the lives of the most vulnerable stakeholder, the people in general, is much better. How do we do this? We tell you that conflicts exist in status quo, because cartels are in like a race for power and race for money, right? Which means to say that incentive is to go ahead and like dominate and have as much of the market as possible. Even if I concede that, even if I say that there isn't as much violence, understand that because cartels have this incentive structure and governments go ahead and push down and target individual cartels, they're necessarily likely to go ahead and say, oh, look, this cartel is no more in the picture, I might as well go ahead and take some part of this. Which means to say they're not going to go ahead and unionize against the government, they're probably going to look at this as an opportunity to expand, which means to say most cartels aren't going to unionize and look at the government as one individual, like one bad player. Secondly, what do we think the lives of these individuals look like, right? Understand if they're in this environment where the cartel is probably taking over this particular community, they're probably like forced to go ahead and work for these cartels, which means to say if this family has a young man working, they probably are forced by the cartel to go ahead and give services to this cartel. They probably don't have choice to go ahead and live their own life, probably do like farming or whatever, or enter into like more structured things that the government can provide and infrastructure that it probably exists, but these people don't necessarily have the ability to go ahead and break this sort of loop, right? What do we then tell you is the best mechanism to, number one, reduce the number of cartels? And I think that's the one thing you do achieve on our end, right? If you're able to like get this sort of information out of the one cartel that's working with you, and they do go and work with you because you're now giving them that information and telling them that if we do take out other cartels, they probably have this incentive to be the monopoly, right? Which means to say you do get this information, which means you now have lesser cartels in the first place. Secondly, because now you have these lesser cartels, you now are able to negotiate with this one cartel much better off, as opposed to it being extremely decentralized and being problematic on that end, right? Second, on violence and common enemies, right? Understand that for you to take some sort of delta in this debate where the government has to push down and reduce the influence of drugs, reduce the influence on cartels, you probably do have to go ahead and have some sort of short-term violence, which we consider, right? We're okay to make that trade-off because if we're able to have some sort of violence because it's necessary, right? You have to go ahead and do this in the first place to take down a bunch of cartels. You do this because in the long run, you're able to now have like one cartel that you're focusing on, you're able to reduce the number of people. How do we go ahead and do this, right? We tell you that we get information on supply chains, we tell you information on like locations and things like that, because this is going to come because the one cartel that is incentivized to go ahead and do this. What do we then achieve? We have lesser cartels. We are able to make this, we are able to better negotiate with these cartels in the first place. I take your
Okay, so if you're saying that the one particular cartel that's cooperating is going to rat out the rest, then you cannot say that they're going to unionize and form one mega cartel.
No, that was the response to O, right? They said that if you're probably taking out multiple cartels, they'll probably unionize to look at you as a common enemy. I'm not saying that the cartels will unionize, I'm saying we're able to take them down strategically one by one, and you have one monopoly that's being created. What do we then give you as a major push, right? We tell you that from the frame that the state is probably not, that probably doesn't have as much trust in these individuals because they're one force and they're in these situations and these, the vulnerable stakeholders, the people in general, don't necessarily believe in the state to go ahead with because they're like stuck in the loop of being under a cartel and they're being like dominated by this and they have no choice, right? What do we then achieve from this, right? Because the state is now able to go ahead and remove these areas from the cartels like power or cartels like cartels control, you're now able to go ahead and create this sort of new dependency from these individuals. What this looks like is now I no more have to work for this cartel leader, now I have the option to like believe in the state because now they've like relieved my country or relieved my area from the control of the cartel. Now state is better able to create some sort of policy for these individuals. You're now able to create that sort of dependency towards the state. It's much better off for these individuals to be dependent on the state as opposed to being dependent on this cartel, and that's entire case, right? They tell you that state, these communities that cartels create is going to be good in the first place. What do we then achieve, right? Because state has now gained this sort of trust from these individuals because they have now been relieved by this control of state. Now you're able to create better policy for these individuals. You're able to create some sort of benefit for these individuals. What this looks like is now you're able to give them the benefits and the welfare that they require, and now they're a part of the state, which means you now have better lobbying power, you have better policy making. You in general have more power as a state because now you have maintained that control, and that's probably second push from us. Lastly, on the way that we go about this, right? This is the only way you can do this, and we tell you from the get-go that if it's decentralized, if you probably go ahead and have this sort of multiple cartels existing, it becomes extremely hard for the state to go ahead and monitor and track where this sort of money is going, where this sort of these channels are existing. If it's one particular state, if it's one particular monopoly, it's much easier to negotiate with these individuals, because from the get-go, you're the reason he came into power. Two, you're able to much better track because it's one monopoly over multiple, so it's less decentralized. Third, because you now strategically took up various various areas, you probably have more control over these areas. So in the long run, you're able to better fight these cartels in the first place. Lastly, what do we then tell you, right? We tell you that the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate, the people are probably better off because their lives look better, because now they can trust in the state. They probably have the sort of advantage that the benefits of the state, that they can actually go ahead and avail these things, and they're no more forced into going into these cartels because number one, they never like the cartels, right? They're being forced into working for these cartels because of the environment that they live in. Second, government has more power in this scenario because now you're able to fight war against cartels better. Two, you're able to provide more benefits towards these people, and you have more people under your umbrella because now they have more trust in you. And lastly, you're able to fight the war on drugs much better for all of these reasons.
I thank the EPM for what was an excellent speech. Now I'm inviting DLO.
In this case, the entire case is that you are going to take down multiple cartels, because of which the lives of people will be better when you have only one cartel left to be. The implicit assumption here is that this one cartel is now a small cartel. However, that is untrue. The point at which all cartel competition has been eradicated, this one cartel gets really, really big because of multiple reasons. One, they have an incentive to expand into the market and acquire more people buying their drugs. Second, it's very easy for them to do so. Third, they have the capacity to do this as well, given that this is probably a cartel that is stable, that does have a lot of money and is ready to cooperate with the government according to their own analysis, which means they have sufficient money to expand their basis of operations. As long as these cartels are able to expand to the entirety of the country instead of the small region that they were concentrated in, these cartels still have the capacity to harm the individuals. The response here that you might get implicitly from their side is that, well, at least cartels aren't engaging in violence with each other. There are two problems with this though. The first is that if it is true that the biggest harm is cartels are engaging in violence with each other, I would argue that violence still continues. The reason for this is currently cartels take care of people by their own analysis. The point at which there is no competition, you have no incentive to take care of people and try to win them over and try to win their areas. As a consequence of which, you can just terrorize people and force them into joining your cartels. The point at which people don't join your cartel, you put a gun to their head and tell them that we're going to kill you and we're going to kill your family. The problem is that these people have absolutely no recourse because this cartel has taken over the state as well, and there are no other cartels to protect these people. There are no other cartels to provide them with safety, to provide them with more money or better competition. So as a consequence of this, the capacity for this cartel to terrorize these people significantly increases. I would argue that they have an incentive to terrorize the people. One, because this gets them more money, they can get more people in line and have them not rat out to the government. But second, they also have basically no morals to stop themselves from doing this. So I would argue in most instances, the point at which capacity to terrorize increases, they would act on this as well. But the problem is there is no government explanation on why you can control the cartel, the point at which it becomes really, really big. Because if you have one cartel that's extremely huge and has no competition from other cartels where its leaders aren't being beheaded, I would argue that this does become like a corporation where you have one leader who has a lot of money, has a decision-making capacity, and this leader is never exterminated because other cartels don't exist anymore to take over this cartel. The government doesn't interfere anymore. The point at which these cartels get too big, I would argue that they buy out government leaders even more. They take over the judiciary, they take over the lawmaking capacity, as a consequence of which it becomes really difficult to crack down on these cartels later on. It's highly unclear why you can cooperate with these people. Just as a consequence of this, their case doesn't work. What's the path to victory on opening opposition? This comes quite clearly in Arjun's speech. We're not saying that the state is all hunky-dory, that we're living in a unicorn-filled world. Obviously, that's not true. Mexico is fucked up. There's a lot of cartel violence. There are a lot of cartels. The problem is this policy makes everything worse. We explain this in three ways. The first is the concession that happens on their end, which is that there are multiple cartels. So it's unclear why one cartel is so big that it can effectively monopolize over other cartels, and even if it can, then this cartel would have probably done so, which means there are multiple cartels which are quite big, which have a lot of power. But not just that, these cartels have existed for decades, which means they have been able to gather a lot of money. As a consequence of which, maybe one cartel is quite big, but it's unclear why they have the majority of the market share. If they did have that, then they would have already dominated the market. They need state support because some cartels are really, really big, some cartels are really, really small, but it's not effective that there's already an existing monopoly. The second thing we tell you is that cartels try to buy out governments because they want to collaborate with them. Collaboration doesn't happen in the ways that they give money to the government, but they try to buy out the corrupt officials because they don't want an active mandate against them, because they want long-term stability to make long-term profits. But the problem is, the point at which you take down this incentive to collaborate with the government, because the government is now actively cracking down on these cartels, you increase that incentive to now collaborate with each other. So all the cartels that were small, that had maybe 10% market share, now collaborate, because the only other option is to go extend the point at which the government puts all of its money into cracking down on them instead of the one other big cartel. So when 5 of the other cartels collaborate, they come together and they make a bigger opposition against the government, against the monopoly. So now you don't just have one monopoly cartel because the government has supported it, you have a monopoly cartel, but you also have another really big cartel. I would argue that's bad. This already comes in all of Arjun's speech. What happens as a consequence of this? Cartels start to collaborate in order to survive. Government assumes that these cartels will easily be eradicated overnight. This is untrue. It takes years and months to just arrest a lot of people, to put them on trial, to carry out different sting operations and and fund your military in a way that you can catch all of these leaders. As a consequence of which, the time it takes for you to help this one cartel become a monopoly, another monopoly or another 2 monopoly come up, because all of these cartels want to survive, all of these cartels start to collaborate. The gov push here will be that cartels hate each other, so they're obviously not going to do that. Well, that is true in status quo, but the point at which this policy is implemented, cartels know that they have no other option if they want to survive. They have to collaborate with each other. What happens when cartels collaborate with each other? First, the harms that gov talks about become significantly worse, because the harm is that cartels fight each other. Instead of having multiple small cartels trying to work in their own areas and fighting with each other, now you have 2 gigantic cartels, or maybe 3 gigantic cartels that are fighting each other, which means they don't just hit each other on the streets. They buy more expensive weapons because they have more money to do so. So they buy bazookas, they buy tanks, right? They exterminate other cartels even more. This clearly increases the amount of violence you get on in the neighborhoods. This increases the number of people that are dying in the neighborhoods. But not just that. Now the stakes are too high. Now it's not just one small cartel dying. Now it's the other whole cartel dying. This means you try to push people even harder. You try to make sure that they don't rat you out no matter what. You try to make sure that people don't protest against you no matter what. Which means you kill more people. You buy out more leaders. I'm not taking a POI. What does this look like? This looks like you actively attack police headquarters, which are only catching the cartel opposition leaders. You assassinate all of the judges that are incriminating you and putting you into jail. It means you actively fund all opposition parties that might actively fund all opposition parties in status quo. All of this is bad because now you have more resources in order to win. I need you to remember that this motion applies with the current Mexican government, but this Mexican government obviously changes over time as well. So the point at which the opposition party changes, the incumbent party changes, because the opposition party now has more resources from the opposing cartel. This opposition party also gets into power, and this change is quite likely. The impact of this is, for 5 years you have cartel A into power, but when the government changes, the next 5 years you have cartel B into power. As a consequence of which, it's unlikely that you weaken all the cartels in status quo. It's more likely that the conflict continues, but it's worse off because now the cartel actively attempts to hijack government institutions and politicians even more. 2 things: they assassinate all of your leaders, and second, they give more money to your opposition parties. All other policies on education, healthcare, taxation now get worse because the leaders who get elected get assassinated immediately so that opposition parties can get into power. But not just that, the Mexican state now looks even more unstable because they don't have a government that cares about such sort of
Thanking DLO for what was.
At opening half, there's a massive lack of a tipping point, particularly with opening government, because they don't explain that if there is incentives for the government to go ahead and probably utilize info and undercut other cartels and crack down on them, then why haven't they done so already? And also, the government, if it is true, is carrying out some form of action, preventative action against cartels in general in status quo as well, then why are these cartels not cooperating or unionizing already? And why is this the unique tipping point to these cartels joining up and becoming worse? This is underfulfilled at opening half on both sides. What at closing government we're going to do is simple. We'll prove why the presence of one cartel reduces the level of interaction that cartel lives have with civilians, and why this significantly increases safety and stability. We don't give a shit whether this means having to use the most aggressive military action or not. We don't give a shit whether this means there's going to be total capture of the government and all institutional services. What the only thing we care about is that civilians are much safer. We're fine with the trade-off that this probably means that the bigger cartel probably becomes stronger and you can't approve them later on in the future. The thesis then just becomes, we don't find a necessity to approve them given that the interference with public life becomes significantly less. The first thing that I want to do is explain why this, explain the tipping point in terms of why this is a significant capacity problem on the behalf of the Mexican government. This will explain why it is necessary to collaborate with the largest cartel possible to go ahead and achieve the outcomes of safety. The first thing I want to note is the POI, that cartel violence has literally gone ahead and eliminated tons of politicians that were presidential candidates. These were the most influential, these were the most popular. This goes to show the amount of influence that cartels have and the amount of power that they have to do this and get away scot-free. This happens in status quo, so all of the premise at leader of op that, oh, cartels are just risk-averse businesses that don't want to inflict violence is literally false. Second, cartels literally have military-grade weapons and armor that they get not only from external actors, but they buy it off from the corrupt members in the Mexican police, in the Mexican armed forces in and of itself. Which means not only do they have like capture of the institutions already, they have the muscle power to do so. But lastly, just empirically, cartel violence is at an all-time high. The leader of the new Jalisco, the Jalisco New Generation cartel was off by the USA, and they have literally gone ahead and started burning entire cities. They went ahead and started going ahead and kidnapping US terrorists, holding them for ransom, beheading them and parading their bodies on the street to send a message. We think this is happening in status quo. We think these guys are already quite violent, and the reason for this to happen is because these cartels want to show that they're dominant, and they're dominant. The reason they need to display this dominance is to display their power to other cartels and show that they are the only one that can rule the place. The point of this case is that when you eliminate the other cartels, the need for all of these displays of power ends up reducing significantly. The first thing I want to do is actually, you know what, prove the frame that Elo tries to say that cartels actually care about business. Yes, it's true that drugs is where they get the most amount of money from. What they're not true about is that violence is something that they don't care about. Instead, violence is a capital expenditure on their side to go ahead and preserve their drug trade, because they want to use violence to instill fear into the people. They want to use violence to hold people of the police force captive and hostage. They want to use violence to be able to buy out protection money to gain leverage over people so that they don't defect, so that they don't rat out, so that they don't go ahead and cooperate with other cartels or undercut their business and that sort of thing. This happens in a tightly competitive cartel unregulated market when everyone is trying to fight with each other and fuck over each other and screw over the supply chain, screw over the stashes, screw over the drug production houses and things like that. That is when they find the need to hire more muscle, get more guns, fight against these cartels, establish secure trading routes for their drugs and establish territory. This is the basis for turf wars happening, which is when the maximum amount of civilian casualty ends up happening, when cartels encroach over each other's territory for selling drugs, when they try to impose authority on each other. Insofar as then we are able to go ahead and show that these cartels on the fringe end up reducing, and this leads to consolidation of all of this area by one large singular cartel, the need for all of this display of power, the need for all of this muscle goes down. Why does this happen? We think one, this happens in quite a collaborative way, and to answer the question at opening up is how do you choose the cartel, we're fine with literally just choosing the biggest and the strongest one. We think even if there isn't one clear guy, there's probably reasonable ways to determine who is currently the strongest or who has the most amount of influence, and we probably say that look, we will cooperate with you, we will take out your competition, we are looking for that, we just need some sort of help for this. The reason why they agree to this cooperation is their own analysis on why this clears out the competitive space. Why this means that they're able to go ahead and sell more, why they can cut out more middlemen, why they have to pay less for safety, why they have to pay less for weapons and things like that. At that point, the collaboration necessity isn't just information as opening government says, because if it was just information, then presumably the Mexican police could have done sting operations or undercover operations and gotten that anyways. The issue is that a lot of these cartels also hold people of the police on payroll and ransom. They prevent them from going ahead and taking out operations because they have people of their families held hostages and things like that. When you go ahead and you enter collaboration, not only does this mean that the government doesn't take action against this one cartel, but it's the other way around as well. So one, it's provision of muscle for raids and attacks onto other cartels. Two, safe passage to the areas where these cartels end up having safe houses, because oftentimes the way cartels operate is through guerrilla warfare in the densely jungle territories of Mexico, where they're able to inflict the most amount of damage on the Mexican armed forces and the Mexican police. This is why the inefficiency of Mexican operations reduces quite a lot.
They still don't engage engage with what happens to the other cartels.
Yeah, got it, yeah. So as a result, what ends up happening is a lot of this collaboration means the operations, even with limited capacity, one, this capacity gets bolstered by the cooperation with this large cartel, but two, necessarily means that you have lesser inefficiencies targeting the operations in and of itself. The issue is, currently in status quo, law enforcement or these cartels are dealing with a multi-pronged battle. They have to fight the state and other cartels, or the state has to fight multiple cartels at once. When they collaborate, they have one factor less to worry about, which means they're able to plan better, they're able to execute better, they have less variables that ends up happening. What all of this means is that when the biggest cartel and the state end up collaborating, there's an insurmountable amount of capacity in front of these smaller cartels, which we don't know if they'll be able to resist or not. The most likely outcome is all of these cartels either get eliminated or they surrender. There is no analysis at opening up to prove why these cartels can put up a fight rather than say, we will be friends, without any analysis on all of this. All of this truly means that there's an elimination of competition, and competition is the true reason why these cartels inflict the most amount of violence, why they go ahead and charge patronage, why they go ahead and charge protection money. When this reduces, we are able to make the life of the average Mexican a lot safer. We actually improve Mexico.
Okay,
Starting in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, I would like to add two horizontal extensions to things that the OG in this debate, OO in this debate is not clearly mentioned. The first horizontal extension that we're making is that when this policy is implemented, smaller cartels and opposition parties have an incentive to come together and put their powers together, because this policy is looked at as a way for them to easily oust the government and the biggest cartel in the area and take over this bigger share of the market and take over the government as a whole. What does this look like? This looks like particular party members within the government leaving to join the opposition parties, because now these opposition parties have more money and more power being supplied by these cartels on ground, which are now having an incentive to fight back against this government policy. This means that this feeds back into the point about like government instability and like opposition parties continuously exploiting the smaller cartels and continuously colluding with the smaller cartels to come together and like outs the government, which means that there's just regional instability and Mexico as a whole just does not have one stable government which can operate for a long enough time to actually curb the level of violence in the streets. The second horizontal extension, guys, remember that when you have one major cartel coming into play, it is a monopoly. It means that this one cartel now has no checks and balances on the quality of the drugs that they produce, which means that the probability is that they're going to produce much more potent drugs. What does this mean? Where are these drugs going to go? If this cartel is able to supply at a very large extent, as CG comes in and tells us, this cartel probably has the biggest supply chain, which means they're probably going to expand the supply chain even more now that they do not have to spend on protecting themselves from the law. This means two things. Number one, they're able to supply all over Mexico. Number two, they're able to supply all over USA and Latin America. What does this mean? The global image of Mexico goes down as a whole because Latin America and USA feel that the Mexican government is colluding with this one cartel to make sure that there is more drugs flooded into their streets. What does this mean? This means that smuggling increases. This means that these countries are now going to look at the Mexican government and point fingers at the government, which was never been the case in the status quo. In the status quo, the US government and Latin American governments know that the drug problem exists, know that drugs are being smuggled from Mexico, but they're looking at it as a smuggling problem. They're looking at it as a cartel problem. They're not looking at it as a government problem. What happens if this becomes a government problem? Two things happen. First thing, the foreign direct investment that comes into Mexico reduces in areas like agriculture, in areas like production of tequila. So things like that make sure that the economy of Mexico basically loses way more money than that can be gained from like producing more drugs. Second thing that happens is USA probably invades Mexico. I know this is far-fetched, but Donald Trump, you know what he's doing. He's invaded Venezuela just because he does not like the ruler over there. If he thinks that Mexico is smuggling more drugs and the government is colluding with this one particular cartel, then he's going to have fingers to point at that one particular cartel, and that means more like external pressure which can escalate into war. How is this worse for the Mexican people? Now, there's not just the people of the government and the people of the cartel who are like holding this axe over your head. It's also external forces, right? Which means that you have way more things to worry about. You have way more things coming in the way of your peace. Also, responses to OG, they say that the cartel which is like going to be chosen by the government is likely to be cooperative. There are three reasons why this is not true. As CG characterizes, this cartel is likely to have market domination, which means they are power hungry, which means they are not going to like subdue the government power because they think that they are like above the government. Second thing, cartel will try to take over the government, and the government will be made like a cartel puppet to basically lobby and like change the laws such that this cartel can grow even more in power and more in like the money that they make. Third thing, these other cartels unionize and wage wars against this one cartel, which means that this becomes a way for this one cartel to spend even more on getting like better artillery and better stuff to protect themselves, even in the case that the government already is providing them military support. Second response, the government trust is not going to exist at all if this policy is implemented for three reasons. Number one, the people in these communities fear cartels way more than the government because the cartels exploit them in ways the government never can, which means that if this one cartel becomes so powerful and that there is no military presence in the neighborhoods and the communities that they operate in, that means that these people are now going to be exploited even more than they were before, and they're going to fear this one big cartel so to the extent that they do not have any trust in the government, and they have no hope that the government can ever save them. Giving this one cartel power means that they have unchecked pathways to exploit people. Number two, opposition party. Oh yeah, I already explained this. Yes, POI.
On note, we have 3 pieces of analysis to say why the cartel capacity that they talk about doesn't exist.
The cartel capacity that what talks about?
You talk.
Okay, fine. I don't really understand the POI now. Moving on to response to the CG. They talk about how interference with civilians they talk about how interference between the civilians and the cartels will reduce. This never happens because this one particular cartel, which is so powerful, is likely to be so powerful because they are integrated into the largest communities and the largest neighborhoods, which means that the civilians in those neighborhoods are now looking at this one cartel as a supreme power, which even the government cannot go against. And these cartels are going to obviously continue to exploit them by doing three kinds of things. They're going to like force these youth in these areas into organized crime and never let them get out. Why? Because now it's like easier to get into it because the government is also not like actively on the hunt for you. Number two, they're going to hook people onto stronger, more potent drugs, which means that these entire communities become unproductive and they all become like drug addicts basically. And number three, it just comes down to like it just comes down to things like direct assault and rape, shit like that. Because like if there's no military presence, then what the cartel's going to do whatever the fuck they want. Yeah. Oh yes, dear.
Yeah, if their incentive is profit, why wasn't like the drugs potent in the first place?
Bro, okay, so when there is a free market, when there are multiple competing cartels producing different kinds of drugs, the point is that the people who produce the most pure form of the drug are obviously going to get more and more profits, which incentivizes like those people to make sure that these drugs are not laced with harmful substances like fentanyl and shit like that, which kind of hooks people on more and like makes them more addictive to such substances. And in the case that you allow this one cartel to establish a monopoly, then all of these people then get hooked onto like more like addictive forms of the drugs and more harmful forms of the drugs. Alright. Okay, so what CEO has basically done in this debate has basically given you two extensions which do not come out of OO, has proven to you why OG's case that the government is like going to form all of this trust in the community is not going to happen, and CG's case basically about how the interaction between these people and the community is going to reduce and it's going to make the street safer never really happens with that member.
Here you are, thanks for inviting now Abhay.
There is blood on the streets of Mexico, but it is side opposition that is responsible and has their hands red with civilians that are vulnerable right now. I want to note there is a deadlock on top half. Opening government presumes that this is going to be amazing and this violence will succeed. Opening opposition assumes that this violence is going to carry on till the point where opposition parties come into power and things like that. The first contribution coming from my speech will just be why this conflict ends up being quite short-termist and why we're able to achieve a lot of our benefits significantly faster. The first, who are the individuals that end up getting targeted right now? These are the easiest pickings, which means that these are vulnerable, these are people that are the drug peddlers, these are people that are out on the streets that are supplying these drugs. I think these are the first people that police have the ability to either pick up or to shoot. It doesn't matter how we do it. But the point is, it is the vulnerable points of supply chain that are the first people to get shot. The first thing that this does, it increases vulnerability of these individuals. So I want to note that most of the people that are involved within cartel activities right now are quite young, they're quite indoctrinated. The point is, when they see all of their brethren dying, they get scared shitless and just don't want to engage with this activity. They would much rather go back home or to stay with their families until after this conflict subsides. But secondly, this leads to an immediate reduction in revenue because you are no longer able to supply these things because a lot of the people that were working and operating on these things, the lower middlemen that you often rely on for robustness, these are the people that are dying, which means that the amount of money that the cartel is able to get decreases significantly, and there is an immediate shock. Why is this beneficial? First, it means that there is lesser money that these individuals have to be able to buy weapons. So even if conflict does happen, it requires a lot of expensive weaponry. So you have to buy drugs, you have to buy bullets, you have to buy weapons, you have to buy grenades and things like that to be able to protect yourself. All of these things are quite expensive. You're already getting these on the black market, so these are costs that end up increasing. The point at which we're able to restrict money and be restricted heavily, your capacity to engage in conflict itself ends up decreasing. But secondly, your ability to do corruption or to be able to persuade policemen to be on your side or to offer you protection also goes down. But your leverage within communities to be able to exert violence and influence over these individuals and win them over to your side also decreases, which means that these communities are also more likely to side with the police and give even more information to make sure that these cartels end up dying down. But lastly, oftentimes these cartels operate on like credit-based systems, so there are like huge industrialists and like landowners and things like that that often give them money to be able to do this. The point at which government enacts this policy, these people are individually scared right now. They don't think that this is an investment that is going to pan out in the future, so they no longer lend you this money in the first place. You instead redirect this money to the big winner, the monopoly, and you want to ensure that your money ends up being successful over there. All of this proves that for the most part, a lot of these small like cartels end up being quite scared. But secondly, I want to note that a lot of the leaders end up rushing out in the first place. If it is true what Yasho says that these are people that are in power right now, and if opening opposition is correct that some level of peace exists, that means that these are leaders that have gotten complacent and are used to security. The point at which they are faced with sudden conflict and sudden outbursts by the government, these are people that were unprepared for this, so they often want to rush back to their safe houses back in Cuba or Colombia and things like that, because that is the only way that they can guarantee their protection, because it's uncertain the extent of violence that is going to happen within these places. This means that the ability of the cartel to be able to do things like with information that only the leaders have decreases. But even in their best case, if they end up deploying their deputy or their shadow leaders and things like that, these are people that often want to increase their image within the cartel itself, so they have strongman leadership ideas and things like that. So oftentimes when your own drug peddlers who are often shot by the rival cartel are like telling you that you don't want to combine with these people, that these are individuals that are out to get you, and this rivalry is not going to work out because they're always going to try to kill you. That is the point where these leaders don't have the incentive to want to collaborate with these individuals. But lastly, I would note that if you have the ability to collaborate and ally with any cartel, then you would more likely just go to the monopoly, and that unlocks all of Yasho's benefits about why one individual cartel itself ends up doing good things, because its incentive to ally and like interfere with civilian life decreases. But even if they in their best case, let's assume that this mega cartel ends up happening, this often just does not work out in their incentive, because there are narratives that are quite easy to sell that often create the sorts of conflict that disintegrate and fracture these individuals. Narratives like, my brothers died more than yours did, why are fewer of my men returning than yours, you didn't fight enough on the front lines, you didn't give me enough resources to be able to protect this. These are narratives that often end up inflaming these fractures and potential rivalry that already existed right now, and all of this means that you just need to crack down on few individuals, and you just need this conflict to persist for a short amount of time. Even if their mega cartel does end up happening, these are obviously cartels that don't end up being powerful in the long term. But lastly then, why is it fine even if this violence ends up being imperfect? I would note that things cannot get a lot worse than status quo. These cartels are running rampant right now. Yasho already proven by the extent of control that they have, even on like middlemen and politicians and things like that, is massive. So the government itself has low capacity and is being threatened by these cartels right now. The point is, when you enact this policy, you tell these individuals that we are going to take care of you, that we are going to crack down on these individuals. But also, if this amount of infighting already exists and there are multiple rival cartels that are going to try to monopolize, this means that a lot of these people are already killing it. Our violence is at least slightly better, because even if we are only able to protect some communities, that is a certain benefit. We're able to snatch back these communities from the monopolistic control and the harms of these cartel leaders. Things that they're currently subject to, like harassment, being stopped on the street, being threatened for business money and protection money and things like that. Even if we only protect like 10% of Mexico, these are benefits that opposition can never guarantee, and their existence of multiple cartels just ends up being significantly worse. The second thing that I want to do is take down CO, because they actually have a promising place. The first thing that they say is that international image ends up decreasing. I want to question the extent to which this happens. Mexico is already quite alienated from the international community. US already has huge incentives to not trust them. Trump has literally spent like $400 billion in creating a wall and in cracking down on a lot of these drug deals and things like that, which means the capacity that the US has to do even worse things or to attack you right now is quite uncertain, and I don't think it's likely to pan out. But secondly, it's unlikely what investor money or what this status quo looks like in terms of the global perception. At least we're able to guarantee that more money comes in from Latin America, the point at which we're able to increase stability on ground, and we're able to prove that the amount of infighting is lesser because there's one cartel that's going to act. That means that more people are likely to put money over here and resistance are likely to fall. Closing off.
15 seconds. Opening government says that the government is corrupt, so cartels is the only option people have. If that's true, people don't run
So if you can ally with anyone and you're already aligned with your rivals, just go to the monopoly because that is where you're likely to be safest in the first place. It's unclear why you have to combine with the weakest people that are already being cracked down and shot in the states. The last thing I'm going to prove is just impact why this mono cartel or the monopoly that ends up existing is just going to be quite good. The first is, of course, you can ask for concessions when the government is choosing these actors, but even if that's not true, you just have no necessity to be able to do the worst things that these cartels do right now. Things like asking businesses and harassing them for money and things like that for protection, you no longer need this protection. The government is giving you a green pass so you can get away with whatever you want. This means that you don't have to kill witnesses and you don't have to get into encounters with police individuals because these are no individuals or barriers that are stopping you, so you have the full go ahead. But secondly, it means that you don't have to run as many secondary businesses as floods and things like that, so you just open up more business opportunities for other individuals within communities to be able to start these things. But even if none of this happens, the fact that there is less incentive for you to be able to maximize profit by starving these individuals and fighting within communities means that you just end up harassing these individuals lesser. You have lesser need to be able to tap into these communities and things like that. So in most instances, you just end up leaving this alone. Lastly, maybe it is true that you are able to end up decreasing competition. This just means that you have lesser competition competing for rich individuals. So you just end up redirecting more of your drugs towards richer individuals rather than having a hedge of poorer people that are going to buy what like semi-fixed drugs or whatever.
There you go. And people to an extent inviting corporate.
The thing I'm going to explain is just further impacting what Khopade was saying and just explain why the external threat of these invasions is probably not going to be as small scale and it's probably going to be likely, right? There are three reasons for this. The first is that the Mexican government has been corrupt, right? And so they've never gone to the extent of outrightly supporting one particular cartel. The second is because I think this policy makes that the Mexican government looks like they only care about this one drug money and internationally this puts them under a lot of pressure, which means that there are a lot of pressure for perpetuating crime, which means that internationally they're just seen as worse off. I'll explain this more later. The third is because the US kind of wants to eradicate this one problem of having drugs going into there, and just historically for a bunch of other reasons, I'll explain later, that Trump hates Mexico and he just probably wants to do these kinds of things. The next thing I want to do before I go on to response at all is just explain why our metric of having invasion, the US invading Mexico or just having more violence is the worst harm in this debate. There are three reasons for this, right? The first thing is because generally invasions are pretty bad. This means that people are going to die out, right? Because this means once this happens, I think the US is going to be targeting the government more than the specific cartels because this is seen as more of a direct pinpoint for the government, for the US to take these things, right? What this means is that you have more and more invasions happening slightly, which means that these invasions aren't necessarily going to be targeting only the specific cartel. You still have things like civilian casualties and all that because this is going to be other deaths and whatever, right? The next thing is just that you still have inter-cartel chaos which is going to increase because you have other cartels targeting you, right? I'll explain why later the other cartels still have capacity to be able to target the bigger cartel, right? The third thing is because you have innocent people who are coerced into these cartels who also die, right? You have innocent people coerced into these cartels probably because they're poor, right? These people grew up within small communities and either A, they got coerced into this because they had no other means of making money or B because just general community biases towards going into these cartels and getting these things, right? The second metric as to why it's the best thing is just I think economically this is just a lot worse in Mexico, right? Firstly, because I think now once this happens, Mexico is seen as a lot more unstable, which means that you have a lot more invasions and a lot more chaos going on in the country, which means that number one, you have a lot of investments being pulled out of Mexico, right? You have things like agriculture factories, all of those are places where investment gets put out. All of those things are places where investment gets kind of put out, which means that once you have less investment and all of that in the country, it means that prices go up, right? Which means that people can't necessarily afford shit and they can't put food on the table, right? Because no people in Mexico are super poor. Yeah, basically. The second thing is because once you do this, I think the government is going to be spending a lot of its money on cartels, right? Because cartels are massive and arms and guns and shit are pretty expensive, right? Which means that even if you supply them, number one, you're going to be spending a lot of money on them. And even number two, once you're targeting other cartels, it means that you're going to have to explicitly go out and target these other cartels, which means that you're still going to be using up massive amounts of money doing this. And I think the money there will be, I think rather than doing that, I think a lot of money can be better utilized in other things like healthcare, education, whatever, the whole normal thing, right? The third reason is I think that the government is now just seen as a lot more unstable, right? Why? Firstly, because people are going to lose a lot of trust in the government. I'll explain this in my response to OG, but once people start losing trust in the government, it means that the opposition essentially is just going to use this as a freeway ticket to try getting into power, right? Because they see all of this, the whole war and all of the economic problems explained and all of the cartel chaos, and they're going to try to push this towards people to get the idea into them that the government is terrible, right? Which means that now you have less regional instability because the opposition is able to take away more into these regional places because these are probably governed by smaller cartels, which means that you have a lot more corruption, instability in the spaces, which means that this is again a lot more people going to die, right? Which means that once even this happens, the next thing is because like people who aren't affiliated with gangs either way, like people who are just normal people living in Mexico, once you start doing this, this is probably going to make headlines. People see that the government is doing this kind of thing. You probably lose a lot of swing voters because even if you know that the government was set up before, at least this thing was hidden. Now it means that people are going to see that the government is outright supporting cartels, and they're going to see this as like an increasing trend of the government becoming worse and worse and worse. So then the government is losing a lot of swing voters, right? Why is that bad? Number one, because like I think the big monopoly cartel is going to be losing a lot of power, right? Because the government is super unstable, which means that other cartels still have more capacity to be able to shoot them, and like just a lot more gang violence like this. The second reason is because like there's these more reasons for the country to look unstable, right? Which means that you still have more and more investment being put out of the country, less money going into the country, all of those things, all of the bad things I just explained get further impacted, right? Moving on to OG, right? Opening government, 1 minute. Yeah, so the first, this is CG, my bad. Yeah, opening government, I have 3 responses to opening government, right? The first is that I think that the first is on trust. I think that because you still have different cartels based on like different communities, these different cartels are still based on like family ties, right? They still have rural areas where these gangs are tied to like the rural gang, right? Which means that people are deeply ingrained within these cartels, right? I explained to you this because of like the poor people or whatever, right? Which means that like even if the government is currently very corrupt, it means that they're supporting a lot of different cartels, right? Because they can just make the money easier that way, right? Once the government is going to start supporting one specific cartels, people start losing trust in these corrupt officials that they previously trusted. Because they probably trusted the corrupt officials before, because at least the government was supporting their small cartel. They're not doing that anymore. The second response is that people who aren't going into gang shit, it's the same thing I explained. Normal people not involved in gang shit still lose trust in the government because they see it as like an increasing trend of whatever going on, right? The third reason is that I think gang shootings and a lot of these things still largely exist. Because I explained to you that these other cartels have capacity to do these things, right? You still have like generational rivalries between these cartels, which means that cartels like just inherently like historically they hate each other, which means that they're going like just a lot more gang shootouts and all of those things, which means that people still die out. And same thing. Moving on to closing government. Never mind, I'm not done with opening government. What does all of this mean, right? Again, this is the same thing that I explained. The government just means that this is going to be like way more unstable, which means that there's number one, less safety for these people, and there's number two, less capacity for the government to be able to go out and do like things, like invest this money into other things and like do things for the people, right? Moving on to CG. Closing government, my bad, I hate this. I'm in the wrong page. Yeah, okay. Closing government, I have 4 reasons why. I have 4 reasons why the conflict is not actually going to be short-lived, right? I'm losing my page. Here are 4 reasons why the conflict is not actually going to be short-lived, right? First thing is because cartels are pretty hard to eliminate, because even if you have one cartel, like ratting the others out, you still need to spend a lot of money to neutralize the other cartel, right? The second reason I think that this is a tipping point for the US to try and come and fuck over Mexico, right? Because not that Trump already hates Mexico. You have things like ICE, like increasingly killing out Mexican people and all these things. I think this increasingly killing out people, which means that Trump hates, he's super racist and all that. There's just more reason for him to come out and do bad things. The third reason is because I think you still have bigger like effects like lesser investment and like the unstable government, right? Which means that you still have long-lasting effects like the economy kind of falling behind. People still have less jobs. It's going to take a long time for investments to come back and like people to get their shit back into place, right? The fourth reason is because I think the cartel leader of the mega cartel will become like this godlike figure, and because of this, I think he can easily be killed by the other cartels. See you.